Work with Prince William, we watch Prince William up close, and lots of what he says in this are things that people and sources have said to us about him and his thought process on things. So what I found really interesting was hearing him.
What if the moment the monarchy had quietly prepared for didn't arrive with ceremony, but with a single appearance that changed everything? Because when Prince William stepped forward recently, something felt different, and people inside Buckingham Palace noticed it immediately. For the first time, it wasn't just the Prince of Wales standing before the world. It felt like a king already in control. And the reaction behind palace doors? Far more emotional than anyone expected. But here's the real question. Did you notice it too, or did it pass like just another royal appearance? Because according to insiders, this moment wasn't spontaneous. It was the result of months of quiet preparation, subtle positioning, and decisions that were never meant to be public. As King Charles III continues to step back due to ongoing health concerns, the shift inside the monarchy is no longer theoretical. It's happening in real time. And yet, no official announcement has been made. So why did this single appearance feel like a turning point? Witnesses describe something unusually controlled in William's demeanor. Measured movements, deliberate pauses, and a presence that didn't ask for attention, but commanded it. It wasn't dramatic. It was precise. Almost as if the role had already been assumed, just not declared. And that's where things start to get uncomfortable. Because inside royal circles, there's growing acknowledgement of what some are now calling an unofficial transition. A phase where the crown hasn't changed heads, but power quietly has. Think about that for a second. If the monarchy is already functioning under William's direction, then what exactly are we witnessing on the surface? Is this still King Charles's reign? Or the early days of something else entirely? Now here's where the story shifts, and this is where tension begins to build. Because while William's rise appears calm and structured from the outside, insiders suggest that not everyone is adapting to this change so easily. In fact, within certain circles, the reaction has been deeply emotional, even personal. And at the center of that reaction is Queen Camilla. Sources close to the situation describe a growing sense of unease from Camilla's side, particularly as William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, continue to take on more visible authority. The shift isn't loud, but it's unmistakable. Decisions are being influenced. Directions are being set. And increasingly, those decisions are not coming from where they used to. So what happens when someone who waited decades to reach the top suddenly feels that position slipping into the background? That's not just a political shift. That's personal. And according to multiple insiders, this is exactly why emotions have begun to spill over behind closed doors. There's a sense that the balance of influence, carefully maintained for years, is being rewritten faster than expected. But here's the part most people don't see. This isn't just about titles or appearances. It's about control over the future direction of the monarchy itself. Because William isn't just stepping in, he's stepping in with a vision. A modernized, streamlined institution that operates differently from what came before. And not everyone benefits from that kind of change. So let me ask you this. If a system has worked one way for decades, what happens when the next leader decides to quietly rewrite the rules before officially taking power? Do people adapt, or do they resist? Because resistance, according to palace insiders, is already forming in subtle ways. Not through public statements or dramatic confrontations, but through tension, distance, and moments that don't quite make headlines, yet shape everything behind the scenes. And this is exactly where the narrative becomes more complicated. Because while the public sees unity, carefully presented appearances, composed interactions, and controlled messaging, what's happening internally tells a very different story. One of shifting alliances, unspoken disagreements, and a growing realization that the monarchy is entering a completely new phase. A phase where William is no longer preparing. He's executing. But if that's true, then another question emerges, one that very few are openly asking. If William is already operating as king in everything but name, what happens when that name finally becomes official? And more importantly, who stands to lose the most when that moment arrives? Because as we move deeper into this story, the focus shifts from quiet preparation to open consequences. And what happens next doesn't just affect the palace, it reshapes the entire royal power structure. And that's where everything begins to accelerate. Because once a shift like this starts, it doesn't stay quiet for long. What looked like a single powerful appearance from Prince William quickly turned into a chain reaction behind palace walls. Because insiders weren't just talking about how he looked, they were talking about what he did next. And this is the part most people missed. Within days of that appearance, sources began pointing to a series of internal decisions, small on the surface, but significant in meaning. Meetings were being led differently. Priorities were being adjusted. And most importantly, influence inside Buckingham Palace was quietly shifting direction. Now pause for a second and think about this. When decisions start changing before a crown officially changes hands, what does that tell you about who's really in control? Because this wasn't symbolic anymore. This was operational. And according to those close to the situation, one moment in particular made that reality impossible to ignore. A closed-door discussion, never meant to be public, where William reportedly took a firm stance on how certain royal matters should be handled moving forward. Not suggested. Not discussed. Decided. And that's when people inside the palace began using a phrase that's now spreading quietly through royal circles. The transition has already begun. So here's the question. Are we watching a future king prepare, or a current king act without the title? Because for some, that distinction changes everything. Now this is where the tension tightens. Because power doesn't shift in isolation. Every move upward creates pressure somewhere else. And nowhere is that pressure more visible than in the position of Queen Camilla. Sources suggest that what began as quiet discomfort has now evolved into something deeper, an emotional realization that the space she once held at the center of the monarchy is gradually being redefined. Not removed, but repositioned. And that difference matters. Because being replaced is one thing. Being quietly moved aside is something else entirely. Insiders claim that Camilla has been particularly affected by how quickly William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, have consolidated their presence, not through confrontation, but through consistency. More appearances. More influence. More alignment with public sentiment. And here's where it gets even more revealing. There was reportedly a moment, described by one insider as deeply emotional, where Camilla expressed frustration over how rapidly decisions were evolving without her involvement. Not publicly, not dramatically, but enough for those close to her to recognize what it meant. A shift she couldn't control. So let me ask you this. If you had waited years to reach the top, how would you react if the system started moving past you before you were ready? Because that's the emotional undercurrent driving everything right now. And it doesn't stop there. Because as this internal shift continues, the role of Catherine, Princess of Wales, becomes impossible to ignore. Not just as a supportive figure, but as an active force shaping how this transition unfolds. Observers have started noticing something subtle but powerful. Where William brings structure, Kate brings stability. Where he signals direction, she reinforces confidence. And together, they create something that the monarchy hasn't had in a long time, a unified front that feels both modern and controlled. But here's the part that's raising eyebrows inside royal circles. That unity is also creating distance. Distance from older dynamics. Distance from previous influence. And most importantly, distance from those who once operated at the center of power. So what does that mean for the balance inside the palace? Because balance is everything in an institution built on hierarchy. And when that balance shifts too quickly, cracks begin to form. Now here's where the story takes another turn. Because this isn't just about emotion or perception anymore, it's about strategy. William's approach, according to insiders, is not reactive. It's calculated. Every move is measured against one standard: what strengthens the monarchy long-term. Not what protects individuals. Not what maintains tradition. What works. And that mindset was already visible in one of his earliest major decisions: how to handle internal controversies that risked damaging the institution's image. Instead of hesitation, there was action. Instead of negotiation, there was direction. And that has sent a very clear message throughout the palace. The rules are changing. So here's the question you need to ask yourself now. If a leader begins making decisive moves before officially taking power, how different will things be once that power is fully his? Because this is no longer about whether William will become king. That part feels inevitable. The real uncertainty is what kind of king he will be, and who will still have a place when that moment arrives. And as we move forward, the next phase of this story becomes even more intense, because what happens next doesn't just reveal William's strategy. It exposes the first real consequences of it. And that's exactly where the consequences begin to surface, because strategy only stays invisible until it starts affecting real people. Up until now, everything we've seen from Prince William has felt controlled, almost careful. But insiders are now pointing to something very different happening beneath that calm surface. A pattern of decisions that aren't just guiding the monarchy, they're reshaping who belongs within it. And the clearest example? It comes from one of the most controversial chapters inside the royal family. Because when discussions around Prince Andrew resurfaced internally, this wasn't treated as a family matter anymore. It was treated as a risk assessment. Now think about that shift for a second. When personal relationships start being evaluated like liabilities, what does that tell you about the leadership style taking shape? According to multiple insiders, William pushed for something far more decisive than what had been considered before. Not gradual distancing, not quiet reintegration, but a clear, structured removal from anything that could impact the monarchy's public standing. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because that decision didn't just affect Andrew, it sent a message to everyone else inside the system. No one is untouchable anymore. So let me ask you this. If even senior royals can be repositioned or removed for the sake of the institution, what happens to those whose influence is already being questioned? Because this is where the pressure intensifies again. And once more, it circles back to Queen Camilla. Sources suggest that the handling of internal controversies became a defining moment in how Camilla viewed William's growing authority. Not because of what he did publicly, but because of how firmly he acted behind the scenes. There was no hesitation, no emotional buffer, just outcome-focused decision-making. And for someone who has navigated the monarchy through decades of complexity, that kind of approach doesn't just feel different, it feels threatening. Because it removes negotiation from the equation. Now pause here. What happens inside an institution built on tradition? When the next leader starts prioritizing efficiency over sentiment, does it strengthen the system or fracture it? Because according to those watching closely, the internal atmosphere has started to shift in subtle but telling ways. Conversations are more cautious. Alignments are more strategic. And there's an increasing awareness that the future of the monarchy may not look anything like its past. And right at the center of that future stands Catherine, Princess of Wales. But not in the way people expected. Because this isn't just about visibility or popularity anymore. It's about influence. Observers have noted that Kate's role has quietly expanded, not through authority granted on paper, but through trust built behind closed doors. She isn't just supporting William's direction. She's helping refine it. And that creates something powerful. A leadership partnership. But here's the detail that insiders keep coming back to. That partnership is incredibly difficult to challenge. Because it combines two things the monarchy rarely balances at the same time: strategic clarity and public connection. So what does that mean for everyone else trying to maintain their position? Because every strong center of power naturally creates a weaker outer circle. And that outer circle is where tensions are now beginning to show. Some insiders describe a growing divide, not openly acknowledged, but quietly understood. A difference between those aligning with the future and those still rooted in the past structure of the monarchy. And when those two groups coexist under the same institution, friction becomes inevitable. So here's a question you might not have considered. Is this transition really about one man becoming king? Or is it about an entire system being rewritten at the same time? Because if it's the second, then what we're witnessing right now isn't just preparation. It's transformation. And transformation always comes with resistance. Now this is where things take another turn, because while internal dynamics are shifting, William's external vision is becoming clearer than ever. He's not just stepping into a role. He's redefining it. Insiders suggest that his long-term approach focuses on a smaller, more effective monarchy. Fewer distractions. Fewer ceremonial obligations. More direct, meaningful engagement with the public. On the surface, That sounds modern. Efficient. Necessary, even. But look deeper, and it raises a critical question. If the monarchy becomes smaller, who gets left out? Because reducing something doesn't just simplify it. It excludes. And that possibility is exactly what's making certain figures inside the palace increasingly uneasy. Because in a streamlined system, every position must justify its existence. Every role must prove its value. And not everyone can. So let me ask you this. If you were part of an institution being reshaped from within, would you adapt to the new system or try to hold on to the old one? Because that choice is now unfolding in real time inside Buckingham Palace. And the outcome of that choice will determine more than just titles. It will determine relevance. It will determine influence. And in some cases, it may determine who remains at the center of royal life and who fades quietly into the background. But as intense as this internal shift already feels, what comes next pushes it even further. Because the next phase isn't about strategy anymore. It's about confrontation. Not loud, not public, but impossible to ignore. And when that moment arrives, it doesn't just reveal who holds power. It reveals who's willing to fight to keep it. And this is where the story stops being quiet. Because once tension reaches a certain point, it doesn't stay behind closed doors. It starts leaking into moments the public can actually see. What looked at first like small shifts in behavior suddenly began appearing in public settings. Subtle changes, slight distance, carefully controlled interactions that, if you were paying attention, didn't feel as natural as before. And people did start paying attention. Because during one high-profile royal gathering, observers noticed something unusual about the dynamic between Queen Camilla and Catherine, Princess of Wales. Nothing dramatic. No headlines at the time. But the kind of detail that raises questions after the fact. They weren't interacting. Not avoiding each other completely. But not engaging either. Now pause here. In an institution built on image, where every gesture is calculated, what does silence between two senior royals actually mean? Because insiders later described that moment as controlled distance. Not accidental. Not emotional. Intentional. And that's where the word started circulating internally. A divide. So let me ask you this. Can a monarchy built on unity survive when its most visible figures are no longer aligned behind the scenes? Because this isn't just about personalities anymore. It's about positioning. And according to sources, that positioning became even clearer during subsequent appearances, where Prince William and Catherine appeared increasingly synchronized, arriving together, engaging together, leading together, while others, including Camilla, seemed to operate on a separate track. Not excluded, but no longer central. And that distinction is everything. Because in royal hierarchy, visibility equals relevance. So what happens when that visibility starts shifting toward a new center of gravity? Now here's where things become even more revealing. Because behind the scenes, insiders suggest that this isn't simply a matter of preference or personality. It's the result of a deliberate restructuring of influence. A quiet recalibration of who leads, who supports, and who steps back. And that recalibration is being driven by one clear priority: the future image of the monarchy. Think about that. If the monarchy is preparing for a new era under William, then every public moment becomes part of that transition. Every appearance becomes a signal. Every interaction becomes a message. So when certain figures appear less involved, is that coincidence? Or is it preparation? Because according to those close to the palace, William's approach leaves very little to chance. His focus isn't on preserving every existing role. It's on shaping a structure that aligns with where he wants the monarchy to go. And that brings us back to a difficult question. If the future requires change, who decides what gets left behind? Because for Queen Camilla, this question isn't theoretical. It's immediate. Sources suggest that as William's influence grows, the uncertainty surrounding Camilla's future role has become one of the most sensitive topics inside Buckingham Palace. Not openly discussed, but constantly felt. Will she retain the same level of visibility? Will her responsibilities change? Or will her role become largely symbolic as a new structure takes shape? And here's the part that adds even more tension. There are reports that King Charles III has expressed a desire for Camilla to retain certain privileges and recognition moving forward. A kind of final request, one that carries both personal and institutional weight. But whether that request will fully shape the future, that remains uncertain. Because if there's one thing insiders consistently say about William's leadership style, it's this: nothing is guaranteed unless it serves the institution. Now stop and think about that for a moment. If even a king's final wishes can be reconsidered, what does that say about the kind of reign that's coming? Because this is no longer just a transition of power. It's a redefinition of authority. And that redefinition is already creating ripple effects throughout the monarchy. Alignments are shifting. Loyalties are being reassessed. And perhaps most importantly, expectations are being reset. No one is assuming their place is secure anymore. So let me ask you this. If you were part of a system where everything you've built could be reevaluated overnight, how would you respond? Would you adapt quietly, or push back behind the scenes? Because that pushback, according to insiders, is exactly what's beginning to surface, not in public statements, but in subtle resistance. Delays, disagreements, differences in vision that are becoming harder to hide. And this is where the tension reaches its most critical point so far. Because for the first time, the monarchy isn't just preparing for change. It's experiencing friction during the process. And friction, in an institution this visible, doesn't stay contained forever. Sooner or later, it shows. But here's the part that makes everything even more unpredictable. The public still hasn't seen the full picture. What we're witnessing are only fragments. Controlled glimpses. Carefully managed appearances that hint at something larger unfolding behind the scenes. Which means the real turning point hasn't happened yet. And when it does, it won't just confirm the shift we've been talking about. It will make it impossible to ignore. Because in the next phase of this story, everything moves from subtle signals to undeniable reality. And when that moment arrives, one question will define everything. Who truly holds the power? And who has already lost it without realizing? And now we arrive at the moment where everything comes into focus. Because when you step back and look at the full picture, this was never just about one appearance, one decision, or one emotional reaction inside the palace. This was about a shift that had already begun, long before the world noticed. What we've seen from Prince William isn't a sudden rise, it's a controlled transition. A quiet consolidation of influence that has gradually redefined how the monarchy operates from within. And whether officially declared or not, the direction is becoming impossible to ignore. But here's the question that matters most now. Are we witnessing the beginning of a stronger, more modern monarchy, or the start of deeper internal divisions that haven't fully surfaced yet? Because for figures like Queen Camilla, this shift isn't just structural, it's deeply personal. And as power continues to move, the emotional and institutional consequences will only grow more visible. At the same time, the partnership between Catherine, Princess of Wales, and William is shaping something entirely new. Something more strategic, more unified, and possibly more decisive than anything we've seen before. So let me ask you directly. Do you think William will become the kind of king who strengthens the monarchy? Or the one who transforms it so much that it never looks the same again? Because one thing is clear. The age of King Charles III is slowly stepping back, and the era of King William is no longer a distant future. It's already unfolding, and the real story. We've only just begun to see it. If this changed the way you see the royal family, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens next, because this story is still developing, and the next update might reveal even more than the palace intends. And before you go, drop your opinion in the comments. Who do you think truly holds the power inside the monarchy right now? And what role should Camilla have in the future? Let's talk about it.